So at this point in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 2 specifically, what Luke is doing is giving us snapshots of the life, the childhood really, of Jesus. And so we saw a couple weeks ago, Jesus is born, the whole saga with the shepherds coming, singing to God. And then last week we talked about Jesus in the temple, 6 weeks old, and Simeon and Anna. And today, we have the story of Jesus now. Fast forward 12 years ahead. He's 12 years old. He's going with his parents to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. And this is, I think, really one of the most unique stories in the entire Bible. It's unique, definitely, because it's the only place where this particular story is found. And it's also unique because it gives us some understanding and insight about who Jesus was, what he came to do, and also his relationship with his father and his relationship with Mary and Joseph. And I think there's all kinds of implications for us today. And so what we're going to do, in the words of Shrek, is we're going to start peeling back the layers of the onion. And hopefully by the end, there's going to be some real relevant stuff that we can apply to our life. So let's dive in, beginning in verse 41. It says, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. So we'll pause there. Every year in first century Judaism, there were 3 different feasts that people would celebrate. These 3 different feasts, you were required, if you were a male, at least to come to one of them. If you're female, it was more of an optional thing, but it was such a fun event that many times families would make an entire trip out of it. And those 3 feasts are these: Tabernacles, Pentecost, and Passover. Now, Tabernacles took place in the fall, and essentially it was a time to remember God's faithfulness to the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness wandering for 40 years. And when you read the Old Testament, you see how they were essentially nomadic, right? They're building these tents, they're going from place to place, they're learning obedience, they're following their God, and finally, after 40 years, they're able to make it into the promised land. And so what the children of Israel would do at the Feast of Tabernacles is they would come to the city of Jerusalem and they would really reenact that event. They would build these makeshift tents out of branches and sticks, and they would all basically camp for an entire week. And it was a fun and festive atmosphere. You have family and relatives and friends. You tell stories sitting around the fire, maybe roasting marshmallows and things for the kids. And it was just a wonderful time to just talk about and to refresh their memory. Hey, this is what God did with us. We went through the wilderness. We lived in tents just like this. And God was faithful to guide us and to lead us, a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. And then secondly, you have the Feast of Pentecost. Now, Pentecost took place 50 days after Passover, and it was a time essentially to remember God giving the law. You guys remember that story back in the book of Exodus. Moses, he goes up on Mount Sinai. He spends 40 days in the presence of God, and God gives to him the 10 Commandments. Well, the irony of the story is, though, the very day that the law was given, the children of Israel were breaking the law, right? While Moses was gone, they were down below, and someone had the not too brilliant idea of, well, Moses, who knows where he is? Who knows where God is? So let's just build ourselves our own God. Let's build a golden cow, and we'll say that that is what delivered us from the Egyptians. And so poor Moses, he comes down off the mountain. He sees what they're doing. He's like, holy cow, I can't believe this. In anger, he breaks the commandments, right? And now he has these broken commandments, these tablets that he shattered in his anger. So he has to go back up the mountain. God's sorry, I broke them, I was upset. And God says, okay, here's a new set, prints them off, hands them to him. Really interesting story. And so Every year since that time, the children of Israel would gather together to remember, reflect, okay, God has given to us the law, and we now have this responsibility to keep the law. And it was an opportunity for them to renew their covenant to him. So you have the Feast of Tabernacles, you have the Feast of Pentecost, but then last, definitely not least, I think the most significant feast of all was the Feast of Passover. Now, Passover, of course, comes from Exodus 12, when God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. And there was a series of 10 plagues, Pharaoh hardening his heart. Finally, the 10th plague, he says, fine, let the children of Israel go free. They were set free through the blood of a lamb that was put on the doorposts of their home. If you've seen Prince of Egypt, you know what I'm talking about. Then they go cross the Red Sea and begin their journey to the promised land. And so every year, tens of thousands of people would come to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate, to remember, and they would reenact some of this story by eating a lamb, by having unleavened bread, and by telling their stories, or telling their children stories of all that God has done. So we begin this story in Luke chapter 2. Mary and Joseph, because of their finances, we saw last week they're a lower income family. They don't have the cash to make all three of these feasts. But one thing that they did choose to do was to make this pilgrimage from Nazareth to Jerusalem once a year to celebrate this feast. So off they go. This is a long journey. If they went around Samaria, which most Jewish people would, it was around 80 miles. So let's check out what happens. They get there, they celebrate the feast, and verse 43 says, after the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. And thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day, and they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. And when they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So check this out. Mary and Joseph, they celebrate the Feast of Passover. We know that this was around a week of celebration. Again, a joyous, fun, family time. The feast ends. Mary and Joseph say, okay, it's time to go back home. They pack up. They leave the city of Jerusalem. They're heading back to Nazareth, some 80 miles away, and a full day into their journey, suddenly they're like, where's Jesus? Do you have him? No? Where was he last? I don't know. And all of a sudden they're freaking out, they're panicking, there's a sense of anxiety. I mean, for us as a parent, is there anything worse than that sense when you've lost a kid? That's horrible, right? I mean, there's nothing worse than that. Like, even if it's just a couple minutes, like, you begin to panic. Imagine an entire day goes by. I remember years ago when I lived at home, my little brother, James, he was 2 years old, and I was asked, hey, Dom, can you go get James, bring him here into the kitchen? And so I went out into the living room to go get him, but he wasn't there. And so I began to look around. I called for my mom, my sister. We started looking for him. We couldn't find him anywhere. We went from room to room, looking around, looking under things, trying to find him behind doors, among his toys. He wasn't anywhere to be found. My poor mom, she's freaking out. Her tears, she runs outside. James, where are you? I go outside. I'm looking. Neighbors start to hear us. So they come out. Pretty soon there's 10 of us combing the entire neighborhood area. Someone about half an hour into it called the police. They show up, lights flashing, helicopters show up. They're sweeping up and down the streets looking for James. I mean, complete chaos. And after about an hour of this, everyone's looking. My mom is expecting and fearing the worst. I run back inside and I'm looking one more time. And just as I was about to leave the house, I stopped and I saw this end table. And I just had the sense I should probably look behind it. So I pulled it back. And sure enough, James, 2 years old, had squeezed through this tiny, tiny gap between the end table and the floor. He had crawled under it into this end table area where no one else could see, curled up in a tiny ball, and was fast asleep. Totally oblivious to the chaos that was all around him, right? No clue whatsoever. So I'm the one, I have to go back outside, tell everyone, hey, thanks for coming, it's been fun. He was inside the whole time. But just that hour was horrible. Now imagine you're Mary and Joseph. It's not just an hour, it's an entire day. And it's not just their son, it's the Son of God. It's Jesus, right? Hey, we've lost the Messiah of the world. This isn't good, right? What do you do with that? And so they are understandably freaking out. Now, I don't know about you. I read this passage and it raises all kinds of interesting questions. And honestly, for me, the elephant in the story is, how do you not know your kid's with you for an entire day? I mean, think about that. Like, it wasn't like their family was that big, and it wouldn't really take too much to discern, okay, he's not in the back of the minivan. What's going on here? I mean, how did they travel this far and not have a clue that Jesus wasn't with them? Well, a couple thoughts for us to think through on this. I think really important for us to get a sense of what's happening. The first point is this. We have to keep in mind the way that they traveled back then. Especially going from Nazareth to Jerusalem, again, 80-mile journey, you would go through some pretty hostile areas. In the first century, there were some places that it was known to be very, very dangerous for travelers. There were thieves, criminals that would hang out in the hills. They would wait specifically for travelers to target them, to rob them. In fact, Jesus in the story of the Good Samaritan kind of alludes to some of that in the distance from Jericho to Jerusalem. And so what they would do is, hey, safety in numbers. So when they made these annual trips, they wouldn't just do it as a small family. No, they would bring along all of their relatives, all of their friends. Sometimes a good chunk of the village would go. And so you could have dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of people, caravan style, making this journey. And so most likely what's going on here, in fact, we know it, verse 44, they assume that he's with relatives. He's hanging out with the cousins and the neighbors and the friends. And so the whole time they just think, hey, he's with his guys. No need to worry, no need to fear. In fact, the first thing they do is look for him with their relatives. Now, the second thing, and I would argue probably even more significant, it has to do with maturity. In the first century, you at the age of 12 were just months away from officially being considered an adult. In fact, 13 was the time when, as a boy, you officially became a man. And so what you would do at the age of 12 is you're in the final stages of preparation for this. You're studying, you're memorizing the Torah, you're learning a practical trade. Generally, it was the trade of your father. He would teach you. Some cases, you would be starting your own businesses, your company. You know also during this time, they were preparing for marriage. It was not unheard of at all to be engaged, to be married at the age of 12. So already they're thinking through wife and children, family and future. So it's so different from how it is now. When you study this period of time, you find that there is much more of a focused insistence that boys would become men. And I think for us, when we read this, it's hard for us to grasp this because we live in a day and age, and I would say it's unfortunate that we do, where it's not uncommon to have guys who are in their mid-20s or even late 20s who still haven't grown up yet. Who there's a lack of motivation and goals and discipline. And there's all kinds of study that's going on right now. New York Times, just a few weeks ago, they had a whole article on this. Another guy, a psychologist, Leonard Sachs, he says, it's actually an epidemic in our nation where guys in particular are refusing to grow up and they're spending all their time downloading porn and playing video games. And all these people are saying, what's happening to this next generation of guys? And so we, coming from the West, we have this filter. We read, oh, Jesus is only 12. He's just a kid. He doesn't know how to handle himself. They would read it and say, oh, he's 12. He's almost an adult. He's preparing to be a leader and a provider. He's setting out the course and the trajectory of his life. So this is absolutely pivotal for us to get here, is that this is not a story of child neglect. It's not like Mary and Joseph are spending all their time Instagramming photos as they're going from Jerusalem to Nazareth, right? No, that's not what's happening here. They're not bad parents. Rather, what's going on, check this out, this is Jesus in the early stages of living out the mission that his Father had given him. So Jesus' ministry is just about to begin. In fact, we see in verse 46, some of that. It says that he was dialoguing with the religious leaders. So when they finally track him down and they see him, he's hanging out with the leaders. He's hanging out with those who understood the law. He's dialoguing with them. It says that he was sitting with them. Now, this gives us some insight into how they taught in the ancient world. The rabbis, religious leaders of that time, they employed what Plato called the dialectic, which was essentially a series of questions and answers. And the point of that in asking these questions is you're wanting to draw the students to open up within their own assumptions. Through the questions, you're creating a field of tension because you want there to be a pursuit of truth in the context of rhetoric. Jesus is doing that. He's moving the conversation forward. He's engaged in conversation with them, asking questions and dialoguing. And it says, as this is happening, they are amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now this to me is really intriguing, the words that Luke uses to describe it. First of all, the word understanding. This speaks of not so much intellectual ability, although that's included in it, but this isn't just the ability to memorize facts and to recite them, but rather it speaks of a much deeper level of understanding. And I think the word insight is probably a better word. It speaks in the ancient world of this ability to drill down deep, to penetrate to the heart of the issue, to grasp, to put together the dots, the bits and pieces of the conversation, to see the broader context and the worldview. And so as they're talking to Jesus, they're blown away because this guy, he's 12 years old, and yet he has this profound, deep understanding and insight of the nuances of the law. And as a result, it says that they were amazed. That word amazed is in the Greek, existanto. And you may wish to write it down. You could do a whole word study on that. This would be another sermon. But existanto is a word that is carefully used by Luke. In his writings, the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts. And often when he uses existanto, the purpose of it is to demonstrate the sense of wonder that you have when you're in the presence of God. So what's going on here? As they're talking to Jesus, they don't know who he is. They don't have the theological understanding of the incarnation yet. They didn't realize that he was the Messiah of the world. But just by having conversation with him, just by talking to him in this environment, they have this palpable sense of the divine, that God was there. They had this sense of the movement of the Spirit of God. It was a conversation that was inspired in the truest sense of the word. And so they are amazed. They're blown away. But they weren't the only ones that were amazed at what Jesus had done. In fact, we keep reading verse 48. His parents were amazed, only in a different way. His parents saw him, and they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and with man. So they searched for him for 3 days. Again, it's understandable why they were so anxious, just beside themselves with grief and worry. And Mary, especially as his mother, she's panicking. And when she finally tracks him down, he's there in the temple. She just explodes like, "Son, where have you been? We've been looking all over for you." And Jesus' response, by the way, the first recorded words of Jesus in his life are these: "Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" I actually like how the New King James puts it here. "Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's business?" So this is interesting. Jesus' very first recorded words are all about him submitting to the will of the Father. His last recorded words before dying on the cross are about the same thing, submitting to the will of the Father. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So Jesus' life and ministry is framed by an attitude of submission, wanting to do the Father's will. So what's going on? Jesus is wanting Mary and Joseph to understand something about who he was. That he had come, his whole purpose was to do his Father's will. That he wasn't on his own agenda, or even Mary's agenda, or Joseph's agenda, but that he was on the agenda of the Father. Jesus, at the age of 12, had a clear sense of calling and mission, and he understood that carrying out that mission from time to time would result in conflict, as other people would have expectations of him. Other people would assume he would behave in a certain way. And when he broke out of that, when he didn't do what others thought he should do, that created the tension. In fact, in verse 50, it says, they didn't understand what he was saying to them. And I've actually got that underlined here in my Bible, because the fact is, even as there are people who just didn't get Jesus, they didn't understand him, they're confused by him, they thought he was crazy. I guarantee there are people in our life who think the same thing about us. They think you're crazy. Why do you do the things that you do? Why are you pursuing God? Why are you living for him? Why are you telling people about him? Aren't you embarrassed? Why wouldn't you step on other people's toes to climb the corporate ladder? Why are you kind to that jerk of a boss? Why are you so insistent on loving people or forgiving that person who wronged you and wounded you? Why on earth would you move 3,000 miles across the country to help start a church, right? I mean, we've all heard questions like this. People think, we don't understand where you're coming from. But listen, that's part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That following Jesus means there will be times when he will have us do things that are against the status quo. He'll have you move in a direction where it's against the current, because any dead fish can go with the flow, right? It takes a live fish to bring about change. And there are times when God will set you on a course and a direction for your life, and it may not be what 90% of the people in your life, sometimes people who are very close, parents, relatives, close friends, and they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. You're going to Jerusalem, and they're saying you should be going to Nazareth. Why are you following Jesus in that way? And something that for those of us who have been walking with the Lord for a while are learning, I'm certainly learning this, is that God's ways aren't our ways. In this story, I mean, one of the lessons is that Jesus does something totally unexpected that even those closest to him couldn't predict. They couldn't see was going to happen. And so too in our life, the Spirit of God's like a wind. You don't know which way he's going to take you, what he's going to do in and through your life. And the worst thing that we can do is try and put God in a box. God hates boxes. Last time someone put him in a box, he broke out 3 days later, right? And so Jesus, I think as we strip back a layer here, part of what's going on is that Mary and Joseph, in a sense, had put Jesus in a box. They just assumed, oh, he's going to follow us because he always follows us. He's our good, obedient son. He always does the things that we want him to. He just follows right along with whatever decisions we make. But in this story, at the age of 12, Jesus momentarily flips it around, momentarily reverses the role. And he's teaching them, look, it's not so much about me following you, but now I want to teach you what it means to follow me. And the way that they learned that lesson was actually very painful, right? The way they learned this lesson is they're traveling an entire day before they realize, where's Jesus, right? Kind of where's Waldo, first century style. I don't know, freaking out. 3 days later, they find him in the temple. And for me, to even, I think, go deeper with this story, this asks me a really, really disruptive question. It kind of lobs this question in your heart that if you dwell on it long enough, it's going to wreck you. It's going to mess with you. And it's done that to me this last week, so I'm going to turn the favor and do it to you. And the disruptive question is this. They had left Jesus behind. Are there any areas in your life where you have left Jesus behind? Maybe at one point you were following closely. At one point, you were going against the flow. You're listening to your Father. You're obeying. You're in prayer. You're seeking him. You're at his feet. And not a moment goes by, it seems, where you're not talking to him. Father, what is your will for me today? How do you want me to handle this situation? What should I do here with this problem? And God's talking to you, and you're talking to him. And it's this beautiful relationship. But then, as years go by, and I think those of us who have been walking with the Lord for any length of time, we are susceptible to this, is that we begin to put our personal prayer life, our seeking him, our devotion to him, we put that on the shelf, and we begin to enter this phase where, like Mary and Joseph, we assume that Jesus is with us and he's going to bless whatever it is that we want him to do. And so it's more about, hey, I'm going to make these decisions and I just assume God's going to bless it. And if it was the wrong decision, he'll clean up the mess because that's his job. And we may not put it that way, but I think that assumption lies deep in our heart. It could be in an area of a job. And I think many of us can relate to this. Maybe there's a time in your life you had this job offer, you took the job, you didn't really pray about it, but hey, it looked good. The numbers added up. There was room to grow and develop. But then a year or 2 or 10 into the job, you realize, wait a minute, was this really the Father's will? Have I perhaps left Jesus behind in this? I didn't really pray. I didn't really seek the Lord. And all these things are happening now. And I'm wondering, have I perhaps gone in a wrong direction? And this certainly happens in the area of sin or compromise, where at the time it seems so appealing, it seems so right, and you're kind of stressed out and the opportunity is right there. And so you click on the website, you gossip with that person, you find yourself caught up in that substance abuse, and you go down that path. And again, kind of in the back of your mind is, well, Jesus is still with me, right? He's going to still bless me. He's going to forgive me. That's his job. He will take care of me. And I know this isn't the right thing to do, but when it's all done, I'll pray, God, forgive me, and it's all good. But then you discover a year or 2 into it, like Mary and Joseph, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I'm like 80 miles away. I don't sense the Lord with me right now. I think I've left him behind. How many of us in the area of a relationship have found this? You're single, you're ready to mingle, you meet this guy, this girl, she's beautiful, he's funny, you're lonely, it just seems to work. Everyone around you says, yeah, go for it, looks awesome. And so you begin dating that person, only to discover a few months into it, it's like, oh my goodness, I don't think Jesus is in on this. I think I may have gone in a wrong direction. This person's taking me to Nazareth, and the Lord is calling me to Jerusalem. We make the mistake of taking Jesus for granted, I think. We make the mistake of assuming too much, that whatever we do, we just assume God's going to bless. But what if it doesn't work that way? Remember Samson? He's kind of described in the Bible as a he-man with a she problem, right? He's this guy super buff, he's super strong, he can take on the Philistines. Interesting guy, but he had this huge weakness for women. In particular, there's this one woman, Delilah, and she begins to tempt him and seduce him and lure him and bring him down this path of sin. And she begins to probe and press him, okay, what is the secret of your strength? And so one night she's playing with her hair, tell me the secret of your strength. Probably didn't sound like that, that would be creepy. And he then says, well, he kind of flirts with the idea. He's like, well, if you put my hair in a weaver's beam, then I'll be weak like any other man. It's kind of weird. She's like, okay. He falls asleep. She weaves his head together in this massive wooden weaver's beam. She wakes him up. Sammy, the Philistines are here. And he wakes up, smashes that thing, takes on the enemy. Now, you would think that if you were Samson, okay, this is a sign this is not a good relationship, right? It's kind of unhealthy. In fact, 4 different times she tried to kill him. If your girlfriend's trying to kill you, get out of it, right? You don't need to be there. And yet he's intoxicated with lust, basically, and he keeps going down this path, and finally one night he caves in and he says, if you shave my head, I'll be weak like any other man. And sure enough, that night she shaves his head. She wakes him up. The Philistines are here. And he gets up, and one of the saddest verses in the Bible, you can read it in Judges. I read it yesterday. It says, Samson gets up, and he said, I will go out as before. I'm going to have victory like I always have. But he didn't know that the Spirit of God had left him. He assumed too much. He assumed that God would automatically bless whatever decision he made. Listen, Christianity is not about you making decisions and assuming that God will bless it. Christianity is the relentless surrender of your will to the will of God. It's not about, hey, Jesus, follow after me, bless my life. That's not Christianity. That's having a life coach. Jesus isn't your life coach. He's not the guy that just stands behind you cleaning up your mess. Christianity is you following him. Christianity is you going about the Father's business. Not my will be done, but your will be done. And what does that look like? Well, it may look like you're going to Jerusalem and everyone else is going to Nazareth. It may mean you're taking a step of faith and everyone else thinks you're crazy. It may mean swimming against the current, refusing to compromise, standing up for truth. That's what it means to follow Jesus. But listen, if we are to follow him that way, it means that we have to seek him. And that's the one thing that I think Mary and Joseph absolutely did right in this story. They're into their journey a day. Where's Jesus? I don't know. And they didn't stop searching until they found him. And for some of us, I really think that's the will of the Lord. That's the heart of the Lord for you today. Maybe you're in a place right now, and if you're honest with yourself and if you're honest with God, you know that you're miles away from where you should be. You know that you've strayed. You know that you haven't put Jesus first. And now you find yourself in a situation like Samson with Delilah. Like, oh my gosh, how did I get here? Do not stop searching until you find Jesus. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. Pursue him. Track him down. He will be there for you. Maybe there's some of us here and you're on the brink of making a decision. Whether it's location or a job or a relationship or whatever it is in your life, and you're about to step into that. Listen, what if God's heart for you today is simply this? Stop. Before you take the leap, before you move in that direction, pray. Get on your knees. Make sure that you are in my will. Sit at the feet of Jesus. And then, when you get the green light or the red light, the peace that passes understanding, that confirmation from the word or from others, go for it. Pursue him. Take that step of faith, but don't dare do it unless you have that sense of assurance that you are following hard after Jesus. It's not worth it. You'll waste time. You'll waste your life. You'll break your heart. What would it look like for you this week to sit at his feet? I can tell you what it would look like because we see in this story some guys who did just that. They sat at Jesus' feet. And what did they discover? They found insight. Wow. He has this discernment and this understanding. He's able to penetrate to the heart of the issue. And so too, when you sit at the feet of the Lord, he will give you that insight. He'll give you that discernment. He'll give you that sense of, yes, this is the direction, or no, don't go there. When you sit at the feet of the Lord, you'll find the sense of amazement, existanto that Luke spoke of, that sense of the presence of God. God, your spirit is here. I'm sensing you. You're calling me. You're moving me. You're directing me. And God, I want to be in you and found in you and following hard after you. I don't want to step outside, even for a moment, what is your will for my life. And when you sit at the feet of Jesus, you discover, like Mary discovered, what it means to be about the Father's business. And he has business for you this week. There are things that he wants you to do, steps that he wants you to take, directions that he wants you to move in, but it begins in prayer. I close with this. Jeremiah 29. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart, and I will be found by you. Let's pray, shall we?